The maid's daughter said to the millionaire, "Kneel and pray, and you will walk." Paralyzed and arrogant, he mocked faith, miracles, and any sign of human weakness. The words spoken by a child who had nothing challenged everything money had built around him. And what happened next left doctors, executives, and skeptics in silence. Robert Thompson didn't believe in coincidences. For him, everything in life was a matter of strategy, planning, and flawless execution. At 53, he commanded one of New York City's largest corporate conglomerates with an iron fist. His mirrored towers dominated Park Avenue like monuments to the power he had built alone, brick by brick, decision by decision, without ever flinching at a difficult choice. Those who knew him well knew that Robert wasn't just demanding. He was ruthless. In board meetings, his gaze cut through any weak argument, any hesitation, like a sharpened blade. Numbers were his native language. Emotions were an unwelcome noise that clouded the clarity of his decisions. For decades, he had built his fortune by systematically eliminating any trace of weakness, whether in his business or his personal relationships. The people around him were pieces on a chessboard he moved with calculated precision. Employees came and went according to their usefulness. Romantic relationships lasted only as long as they didn't demand more than he was willing to offer, which usually meant very little beyond his occasional presence. Even his sister Beatrice, with whom he had grown up sharing a small apartment in Queens, had been pushed away after an argument over values Robert considered obsolete. Compassion to him was a luxury for those who could afford to waste time and resources. The mansion where he lived, on the Upper East Side, perfectly reflected his philosophy. Modern, minimalist, with clean lines and neutral colors. Everything had its place. Nothing was superfluous. The decor told no stories, displayed no memories. It was purely functional, as he believed everything should be. The only luxury he allowed himself was the panoramic view from his top-floor office from where he could contemplate the city he had conquered. Edward Miller had been his partner for 15 years. Together, they had expanded the corporate group from 3 to 19 companies, spanning real estate development, tech, and investments. Robert had always been the strategic brain, while Edward handled public relations and the corporate image. The partnership worked because each understood his role, or at least, that's what Robert believed. Edward was different from him in many ways. Where Robert was cold, Edward was charismatic. Where Robert intimidated, Edward charmed. But they both shared the same voracious ambition, the same willingness to do whatever it took to win. This similarity kept them united, even when tensions arose, and tensions had arisen recently. Robert had been considering a restructuring that would give him absolute majority control. Nothing personal against Edward, just business logic. Concentrating power meant faster decisions, less bureaucracy, more efficiency. Edward smiled when Robert first mentioned the idea, but there was something in that smile that didn't reach his eyes. On the last Tuesday of March, Robert had a meeting scheduled with foreign investors at a hotel in Midtown South. The traffic was a nightmare, as always, and he decided to use the parking garage's emergency stairwell to save time. It was a habitual move, something he did frequently. That hotel belonged to his own group, so Robert knew every hallway, every shortcut. But on that day, something was different. The handrail gave way under his hand. It shouldn't have. It had been inspected recently, like everything else in that building. Robert felt his body lose its balance. For a fraction of a second, his analytical brain still tried to calculate the angle of the fall, the distance to the floor. Then, only the impact. The sound of his own body hitting the concrete was the last thing he heard before the darkness. He woke up 3 days later at Mount Sinai Hospital, surrounded by doctors and nurses. The fluorescent light burned his eyes. Sounds were muffled, as if he were underwater. Edward was there, sitting in a chair beside the bed, with an expression of concern that Robert, even in his confused state, registered as strange. Too rehearsed. Perfectly calibrated between relief and sorrow. The diagnosis came soon after, delivered by a renowned neurologist who couldn't hide the gravity of the situation. Dr. Evans was known for his clinical frankness, and he didn't spare Robert the details: spinal cord injury, irreversible damage, paralysis. Of the lower limbs. The words were spoken with professional clarity, but Robert heard them as if they were being said about someone else. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening to him. He demanded a second opinion, a third, a fourth. He brought in specialists from other countries. They all confirmed the same thing. His mind, so accustomed to solving problems, to finding solutions, had for the first time hit an insurmountable wall. There was no strategy. There was no possible negotiation with his own body. Edward visited daily at the hospital, always with an appropriately concerned expression. He brought business reports, updates on important clients, decisions that needed to be made. Robert appreciated it. It was the only thing that still made sense amidst the chaos. Numbers, strategies, plans, things he could control, even if his own body had betrayed him. But there was something in Edward's eyes, something that Robert, his lucidity impaired by medication, couldn't yet fully identify. A subtle urgency, an anxiety disguised as professional zeal. "We need to make some decisions quickly," Edward would say, flipping through documents. "The investors are nervous about your absence. We need to show stability." Robert signed the papers Edward brought, trusting in their 15-year partnership. He didn't have the energy to question. He didn't have the mental clarity to analyze every detail as he used to. He just trusted. The following months were a blur of contained anger and wounded pride. When he was finally discharged and returned to his mansion, Robert refused rehabilitation with the same stubbornness with which he had always refused anything he considered useless. Why learn to live in a wheelchair if it was unacceptable? Why accept a life that wasn't worth living? The physical therapy sessions were, in his view, a surrender. And Robert Thompson had never surrendered to anything. The physical therapists came, tried to convince him, received icy refusals, and eventually stopped coming. Doctors called, suggesting treatments, and found a man who didn't want to be treated. He pushed away everyone who tried to help. Old colleagues who showed up with words of comfort were met with cold silence. Nurses who dared to be too kind were replaced by more distant, efficient professionals. Even Edward, who insisted on visiting weekly, was tolerated only because he brought business reports. The conversations were brief, technical, devoid of any humanity. The mansion, once a symbol of achievement, transformed into a voluntary prison. Robert began to live exclusively on the ground floor, in one of the bedrooms that had been hastily adapted. He refused to look at the upper floor, where his office, his throne, was located. The curtains remained drawn. Natural light was an assault. He preferred the dimness, which better matched his state of mind. Faith was something that had never been part of his life. Religion, in his view, was a crutch for weak minds that needed fanciful narratives to deal with reality. Now confined in this body that had betrayed him, the idea of a benevolent God seemed even more absurd. If there was some higher power, it certainly had a cruel sense of humor. Helen had worked at the mansion for 12 years. She was one of the few employees Robert kept because she perfectly understood the basic rule: do your job in silence and disappear when you're not needed. She handled the cleaning and organizing with discreet, almost invisible efficiency. Robert barely knew any details about her life. It wasn't his habit to be interested, but Helen knew a lot about Robert. 12 years of observing someone up. Close reveals more than words. She saw how he worked late every night, how he never had visitors who weren't business-related, how the immense house was always empty of laughter, of life, of human warmth. She felt sorry for him, even knowing that Robert would despise any form of pity. It was on a July morning 6 months after the accident that the routine changed. Helen showed up accompanied by a girl of about 7, brown hair tied in a ponytail, a slightly wrinkled school uniform, a backpack with cartoon characters on it, and curious eyes that scanned every corner of the house as if discovering a new world. Robert was in the living room in his wheelchair, flipping through reports that no longer made much sense. Numbers that once danced in his mind now seemed like dead letters on paper. He heard the childish voice before he saw the child. "Mummy, this house is way too big. Does one person live here all alone?" Helen murmured something low, embarrassed, trying to quiet her daughter, but the girl had already appeared at the living room doorway. Upon seeing Robert, she showed no fear or discomfort. She just tilted her head to the side. observing him with a disarming frankness that only children possess. "Hi, I'm Sophia." Robert didn't answer. He looked at Helen with an expression that made his disapproval clear. The housekeeper hurried to explain, words tumbling over each other. "Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry. Sophia's school had a plumbing problem and they let the kids out early. I couldn't leave her with anyone. The neighbor who watches her is out of town. I promise she'll be quiet. She won't be any trouble at all." Helen's voice trembled slightly. She knew her boss well enough to know that unforeseen events were not tolerated. Robert could fire her on the spot. It would be completely consistent with the man he had always been. But something about the presence of that child momentarily disrupted his automatic response. Maybe it was the accumulated exhaustion of months. Maybe it was his growing indifference to everything. Maybe it was just the fact that firing Helen would require finding a replacement, training them, establishing a new routine, and all of that seemed like an unnecessary effort. He just waved his hand, a vague gesture that Helen interpreted as permission. Sophia didn't move away. She stood, there in the doorway, observing the scattered papers, the wheelchair, the man who seemed so different from all the adults she knew. Her teachers smiled. Her mother smiled. Even the grumpy neighbors at least tried to smile when they saw her. But this man had a face that seemed to have forgotten how. After a silence that felt too long, she said with that brutal sincerity only children have, "You look really sad." Robert felt something strange rise in his throat. Irritation, probably. But when he opened his mouth to dismiss her with some sharp phrase, he found he didn't even have the energy for that. The words died before they were born. He just turned his eyes back to the reports, ignoring her presence. "Sophia, come here, let him work," Helen called from the kitchen, her voice laced with urgency. The girl obeyed, but not before saying one more thing, words that came out as naturally as breathing. "My teacher says that when someone's sad we can pray for them. Can I pray for you?" Robert didn't even look up. He just responded with a guttural sound that could have meant anything. Sophia seemed to interpret it as a yes because she clasped her little hands, closed her eyes and whispered something he couldn't quite hear. Then she ran to the kitchen, leaving Robert alone with his thoughts. In the following days, Sophia's presence became an unexpected constant. Helen explained, with a firmer voice now that the first permission had been granted, that she would have trouble finding someone to watch her daughter during the school break. The school was on recess. The neighbor was traveling. She had no close family in New York. Robert, surprisingly, didn't object, not because he had softened, simply because he was too tired to care. The girl had an incredible ability to fill silences. She talked to herself, inventing stories for her dolls. She hummed children's songs she learned at school and church. She drew in old notebooks Helen brought, using worn-out colored pencils that colored the world with an intensity disproportionate to her reality. Sometimes she would stay in the same room as Robert, sitting on the floor, doing her own thing, without demanding attention. Other times, she would try to start a conversation with questions that were disarming in their simplicity. "Were you ever a kid?" "Everyone was a kid once." "And did you play?" "Not much." "Why?" "Because I had more important things to do." "More important than playing? That must have been really boring." Robert didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought of his own childhood as boring or joyful. It was just a period he had to get through to reach adulthood, where he could finally have control over things. Playing had always seemed like a waste of time. Even as a child, Robert organized his toys by category, established rules for games and preferred activities with clear objectives. Sophia didn't seem bothered by his short, curt answers. She kept coming back, kept trying. Sometimes she would bring drawings she made and leave them on the table, within his reach. They were simple images, made with the peculiar logic of a child's imagination. A house with a smiling family, a yellow sun with disproportionate rays, a dog that looked more like a potato with legs. One day, Robert picked up one of the drawings and looked at it for longer than he intended. It was him, or at least it was what Sophia thought he looked like. A man in a wheelchair, but next to him was her, holding his hand. Above it, written in shaky, uneven letters, "Friends." Friendship was a concept Robert had systematically avoided throughout his adult life. Friends were emotional concessions. They were vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. They were people who would eventually expect something in return, who would create non-contractual obligations, who would complicate the clarity of professional relationships. But this child offered something without expecting anything. She didn't want his money. She didn't want his favors. She had no hidden agenda. She wasn't trying to gain an advantage. She just existed there, with a simplicity he had forgotten was possible. One afternoon, while it was raining outside and the sound of water hitting the windows created a hypnotic rhythm, Sophia was drawing on the living room floor. She began to sing softly, almost whispering. It was a religious song, probably learned at the church she attended with her mother. The lyrics spoke of divine protection, of unconditional love, of someone who never abandons you even when all seems lost. Robert felt a strange pang in his chest. It wasn't physical discomfort, it was something else, something he couldn't name because he hadn't allowed it to exist for a very long time. The song continued, sweet and completely off-key, filling the empty room with a presence that wasn't his own. And for the first time in months, Robert Thompson felt something other than anger and wounded pride. He felt a tiny curiosity about that faith the girl carried so naturally. He didn't believe. He still thought it was all fantasy. But there was something in her certainty, in the peace that emanated from those simple words, that touched places he thought he had sealed off forever. The girl would keep coming, and something slow and inexorable was beginning to shift in the foundations of the fortress Robert had built around himself. The weeks that followed brought a routine Robert would have never imagined. Sophia became a daily presence in the mansion, and her quiet influence began to spread into the darkest corners of that empty house. The girl had a gift for turning ordinary moments into something extraordinary. A boring afternoon became an impromptu drawing session. A heavy silence was filled with songs she made up on the spot, mixing melodies she learned at school with completely nonsensical lyrics. Robert still didn't smile. He still maintained his distant posture, his short answers, his gaze that revealed no emotions. But now, when Sophia arrived in the morning, he no longer felt that automatic irritation. It was something closer to resignation, or perhaps, and this he would never admit out loud, something close to expectation. One day the girl showed up with a well-used children's storybook, its cover creased and pages dog-eared. She sat on the floor next to his wheelchair and began to read aloud, stumbling over difficult words, pausing to show the colorful illustrations that took up half of each page. It was the story of a lonely giant who lived isolated in a castle on a mountaintop, feared by all the inhabitants of the valley. Children ran when they heard his footsteps. Adults told scary stories about his cruelty. But one day, a fearless little girl visited him and discovered that he was just lonely, that he had never learned how to connect with people, that his frightening appearance hid someone who never had the chance to be different. The parallel did not go unnoticed. Robert felt a familiar discomfort, the kind that always came when something touched too close to the truth he preferred to ignore. But he didn't interrupt the reading. He let Sophia continue to the end, when the giant learns that being strong doesn't mean always being alone, that high walls can protect, but can also imprison. When she closed the book, she looked at him with those brown eyes full of a wisdom that didn't match her 7 years. "Do you feel lonely?" "No." The answer came out too quickly, too automatically. Sophia tilted her head, studying his face with an intensity that bothered him. "It's okay to feel lonely. My mom says everyone feels lonely sometimes, but we don't have to stay lonely for real. We can let people in." Robert didn't know what to say. He changed the subject with a grunt and asked her to go do something else. Sophia obeyed without complaint, but before she left, she placed the book on the table, marked to the page where the giant finally opens the castle doors. Hours later, when the house was empty and silent, Robert found himself flipping through the pages, looking at the illustrations. He ran his fingers over the drawing of the giant, slowly learning to open the doors he had locked for so long. And he felt something stir inside his chest, something uncomfortable and strange. While these quiet moments were happening inside the mansion, the outside world began to press against the walls Robert had erected. Edward continued his weekly visits, but there was a subtle change. He seemed more rushed, less interested in actually talking. He brought documents for Robert to sign, always with vague explanations about necessary reorganizations, cash flow adjustments, strategic realignments. "You need to trust me right now," Edward would say, with that smile Robert knew so well. "I'm taking care of everything while you recover." And Robert signed. Because it was easier than questioning. Because admitting that Edward might be doing something questionable would mean admitting he had lost control, and that admission was more painful than any physical injury. But some things were starting not to make sense. Small details in the financial reports, decisions made without prior consultation that would have previously been discussed at length, a growing urgency for Robert to delegate broader powers. It was Helen who first planted the seed of suspicion. She had worked at the mansion for so long that she knew Robert's behavioral patterns, knew when something was different. And there was something different about Edward's visits. One day, while tidying the living room after Edward had left, Helen commented casually, "He seems really eager to get you to sign things quickly." Robert looked at her with irritation. It wasn't his habit to discuss business matters with employees. "That's none of your business." "I know, I'm sorry, it's just... I've worked here long enough to know how you used to be with important papers. You used to read everything 3 times before signing anything." The observation hung in the air. Robert didn't reply, but he didn't forget it either. That night, for the first time in months, he took the documents Edward had brought and read them carefully. Really read them, not just skimmed. And he saw things he didn't like. Asset transfers, changes in the shareholding control structure, decisions that, when accumulated, were slowly transferring real power from Robert to Edward. Nothing illegal. All within the contractual frameworks they themselves had established. But it was definitely not what Robert would have approved if he had been at his full analytical capacity. Confronting Edward would require admitting weakness. It would require acknowledging that he had signed things without reading them properly. It would require showing vulnerability. So Robert held on to the information, deciding to watch more closely. After all, he was still Robert Thompson. He still knew how to play the game. Meanwhile, Sophia continued to be the only positive constant in that sea of uncertainty. She had a special ability to sense when Robert was in a particularly bad mood, and on those days, she would simply sit near him in silence. She didn't try to talk. She didn't try to cheer him up. She just existed there, a small, constant presence. One day, after a particularly long period of shared silence, she took his hand. It was a simple gesture, natural for her, but it shot through Robert like an electric shock. No one touched him. The nurses touched him when necessary, but it was a clinical, functional touch. This was different. It was human connection with no purpose beyond itself. "Your hand is cold," Sophia said. "It's always like this." "No, it's colder today. You're worried." "That's none of your business." But Sophia didn't let go of his hand. She stayed there, holding it with that gentle persistence that was impossible to refuse. And Robert, the man who had always avoided physical contact, who saw hugs as an invasion of personal space, let her. Not because he wanted to, because he didn't have the strength to refuse, and because, surprisingly, it wasn't as uncomfortable as he had imagined. Helen watched these moments from a distance, and contradictory feelings vied for space in her heart. There was resentment there, old resentment, carefully guarded for years. But there was also something softer. A small, almost imperceptible hope that maybe people could change, that maybe even Robert Thompson could discover there was more to life than power and control. It was on a September afternoon, while Sophia was drawing and Robert was pretending to read reports, that Helen decided to share part of her story. She hadn't planned it. The words just found their way out, as if they had been waiting too long. "Mr. Thompson, can I ask you a question?" He grunted something that could be interpreted as permission. "Why did you never get married? Never have children?" The question caught Robert off guard. No one asked him personal questions. People knew it was off-limits territory. But Helen had been there for so long she had crossed some invisible line that now authorized her to ask, "I didn't see the need." "The need for what? For family?" "For complications. Family is a complication." Helen was silent for a moment, processing. Then, in a lower, almost confidential voice, "You know, I also thought it would be a complication when I found out I was pregnant with Sophia. Her father had left me. I had no money. I was working 2 jobs just to make rent. It seemed like bringing a child into the world would be the worst possible decision." Robert looked at her, genuinely surprised. It was the longest conversation they had had in 12 years. "And what made you not give up?" Helen smiled, a small but genuine smile. Her, Sophia herself. Even before she was born, even when she was just a possibility, she was already the most important thing in my life. And after she was born, well, all the complications were worth it. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. Then she took a deep breath and went on. Especially when she got sick. When she was born, the doctors found she had a heart condition. Nothing too serious, they said, but it needed treatment. I didn't have the money. I didn't have good enough health insurance. I was desperate. Robert felt an icy chill run down his spine. There was something familiar about that story, something he didn't want to recognize. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. "I asked for help. I came to you years ago. Remember?" And Robert remembered. The memory came back sharply now, without the fog of post-accident medication. A desperate woman, holding back tears with tremendous effort, begging for an advance, for a loan, for anything. And him, sitting in that office on the top floor of this very house, denying her with the coldness he had always used to maintain clear boundaries. "Personal and professional matters don't mix," he had said. "Look into the public health system." Robert looked at Sophia, who was drawing, oblivious to the adult conversation, happy in her world of colors and imagination. That child who smiled at him every day, who held his hand, who prayed for him, was the same one he had indirectly condemned to depend on luck. "And what happened?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "I found help in other ways. The church held a fundraiser. My family lent what they could. It took longer than it should have, and Sophia suffered more than she needed to. But we got the treatment. She survived. She grew up healthy." Helen paused, and when she continued, her voice had a weight that Robert felt physically. "But I never forgot that day. I never forgot the coldness in your eyes when you told me to go to a state-run clinic. As if I were just a number, a replaceable employee." Robert couldn't look at her. Couldn't. He looked at his own hands, useless on the armrests of his wheelchair. The irony was not lost on him. Now he was the vulnerable one. Now he was the one who depended on the kindness of others. And this woman, whom he had humiliated years ago, was here, taking care of him with efficiency and, surprisingly, without cruelty. "Why do you still work here?" he finally asked. "Because I need the job. Because the pay is good. Because—" Helen hesitated, searching for words. "Because a part of me wanted to see if you were just a monster, or if there was something human hidden somewhere inside. And did you find it?" Helen looked at Sophia, who was now humming softly as she drew. "I'm still deciding." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with truths that neither of them knew how to process. Finally, Robert spoke, and the words came out with difficulty, as if they had been stuck for a long time. I'm sorry." They were the hardest words he had ever had to say, not because they were complex, but because they required something he had always avoided: vulnerability. Admitting a mistake, acknowledging that he had, caused unnecessary pain to someone who didn't deserve it. Helen looked at him for a long moment. She didn't smile. She didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. The words didn't undo years of hurt. They didn't erase the memory of a desperate mother being sent away with cold indifference. But there was recognition there, a tiny beginning of something that could eventually become forgiveness. "Thank you for saying that," was all she replied. Then she went back to her work, leaving Robert alone with his thoughts. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He lay awake thinking about the choices he had made, not because they were morally right, but because they were convenient. About a child who almost didn't get the chance to grow up because of the calculated coldness of a man who thought himself above human concerns. And for the first time in decades, Robert Thompson wondered who he really was when you took away all the power, all the money, all the achievements. What was left when it was just him, without armor, without strategies, without masks? The answer he found wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. And honesty, he discovered, was a small but essential first step toward something he couldn't yet name, but which was beginning to feel important. It was beginning to feel necessary. It was beginning to feel human. October arrived, bringing humid heat and rising tensions. Robert began to systematically review every document Edward had brought him over the past few months. He did it at night, when the house was quiet and Sophia had already gone home with Helen. With every page, every contract analyzed with the attention he used to dedicate before the accident, a pattern emerged. A calculated, meticulous, and devastatingly efficient pattern. Edward was systematically taking control of the empire they had built together. Not abruptly or illegally. That would be amateurish. Edward was too sophisticated for that. He was doing it through seemingly technical restructurings, asset transfers justified by operational efficiency, and governance changes presented as necessary modernization. But the end result was clear. In 6 months, Robert had signed documents that transferred real and substantial power to Edward. He was still the majority shareholder on paper, but effective control of operations, strategic decisions, and the group's direction was now in Edward's hands. Robert felt anger. Not the explosive, useless anger of the first few months, after the accident. This was something colder, more calculated, the anger of someone who recognizes when they've been outplayed at their own game. And he had to admit with bitterness, Edward had played brilliantly. But there was something more disturbing. A question Robert couldn't stop asking himself: was the accident really an accident? The idea emerged as an inconvenient whisper, easy to dismiss at first. But the more he thought about it, the more elements didn't fit. The handrail that gave way in a building owned by his own group, a handrail that had been recently inspected. Edward's expression at the hospital, that overly rehearsed concern. The rush to have Robert sign documents while he was still under the influence of heavy medication. Robert knew he was entering dangerous territory. Paranoia was easy when you were vulnerable, when control had completely slipped away. But decades of business experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that something was deeply wrong. He discreetly hired a private investigator, not just anyone, but someone who specialized in delicate corporate matters, someone who knew how to operate in gray areas without leaving a trace. He instructed a full investigation into the accident, the building's inspection reports, and any irregularities that could be found. While he waited for the results, life went on. Sophia continued to fill the days with her light and persistent presence. She had started bringing books from school to read aloud, not because Robert asked, but because she had decided it was a good idea. They were simple children's stories, but there was something comforting in that routine. One day, she brought a book about forgiveness. The story was about 2 brothers who fought constantly until something bad happened, and they realized that holding a grudge hurt more than forgiving. Sophia read with her still childish voice, stumbling over difficult words, but imbuing each sentence with a seriousness that made her seem older. When she finished, she looked at Robert with those eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Do you have someone you need to forgive?" "Everyone does," Robert answered, more to himself than to her. "And have you forgiven them?" Robert fell silent. He thought of Beatrice, his sister, estranged for over a decade over disagreements that now seemed foolish. He thought of employees he had fired with cold indifference. He thought of Helen begging for help for her sick daughter, being sent away as if she were nothing. He thought of himself, of the man he had become. "I'm trying," he said finally. "It's harder than it looks. My teacher says that forgiving isn't saying that what the person did was right. It's just deciding not to let the bad thing keep making you feel bad." A child's wisdom, filtered through well-intentioned teachers, but it carried a fundamental truth. Robert nodded, not trusting his own voice to reply. The investigator's report arrived 3 weeks later. Robert read it alone, in his room, his hands trembling slightly. What he found was worse than he had imagined. The handrail hadn't given way by chance. The forensic analysis the investigator had managed to arrange, discreetly reviewing the materials from the original report, showed signs of sabotage. Nothing obvious, nothing a standard inspector would notice, but there was purposeful wear at strategic points, applied with enough technical knowledge to ensure the railing would fail under a specific weight, but not in a way that looked clearly intentional. More disturbing, payment records showed that the company responsible for the building's maintenance had received significant funds from a shell account days before the accident. The account was closed shortly after. The investigator couldn't fully trace the origin, but there were enough connections to suggest the involvement of someone with access to significant resources from within the corporate group itself. And there was more. Intercepted conversations between Edward and third parties, obtained in a way that Robert preferred not to question the legality of, showed discussions about solving the Robert problem and accelerating the power transition. Nothing explicitly criminal enough to be taken to court, but suggestive enough to leave little room for doubt. Edward Miller, his partner of 15 years. His business partner, the man he had trusted, had orchestrated the accident. He had planned to leave him incapacitated to take control of the empire they had built together. Robert felt nauseous. Not because of the physical danger he had faced, though that was serious, but because of the betrayal, because someone in whom he had placed trust, however limited, had meticulously planned his destruction. Part of him wanted to act immediately. Confront Edward, expose everything, use the available legal resources to destroy the man who had tried to destroy him. That was the response the old Robert would have given. Swift and total revenge. But there was another part, a new and still fragile part that hesitated. That wondered if revenge would solve anything, that recognized Edward was just using the same tactics, the same win-at-all-costs philosophy that Robert himself had always preached. That night, Robert didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, processing not just the betrayal, but what it revealed about the life he had built. Edward wasn't an aberration. He was a product. He was someone who had learned to play the game exactly as Robert had always played it. The next morning, Sophia arrived early with Helen. The girl ran to the living room where Robert was, as she always did, but stopped when she saw his face. "You look different today." "I'm fine." "No, you're not. Your eyes are sad. Sadder than usual." Robert tried to smile, but the effort failed. Sophia came closer and, without asking permission, climbed onto his lap. It was the first time she had done that. Robert tensed, unsure how to react. "When I'm sad, my mom hugs me," Sophia explained, wrapping her thin arms around his neck. "It makes the sadness smaller." And Robert Thompson, the man who had spent 53 years avoiding physical contact, who saw hugs as weakness, who had built insurmountable emotional walls, let a 7-year-old child hug him. And he discovered she was right. The sadness didn't disappear, but it became more bearable. Helen appeared at the doorway, saw the scene, and her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. She just stood there, witnessing a moment that had seemed impossible months ago. After Sophia let go and went back to playing, Robert called Helen. "I need a favor that has nothing to do with work." Helen approached, cautious. "I need my sister's number, Beatrice. Do you know where it's filed?" Helen knew the house well enough to know exactly where to find it. She returned minutes later with a small contact book Robert hadn't opened in years. He looked at the number, written in a handwriting he no longer recognized as his own. It was so old. "Do you want me to call?" Helen offered. "No, I'll call." But it took him hours to gather the courage. Finally, in the middle of the afternoon, while Sophia was engrossed in her drawing, Robert dialed the number. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. "Hello?" Beatrice's voice. Older, more tired than he remembered, but unmistakably hers. "Beatrice, it's me. Robert." Silence on the other end. A silence long enough for Robert to think she would hang up. But then she spoke, her voice laden with conflicting emotions. "Robert, after all these years, I know I have no excuse for the time I let pass, but I'd like to talk, if you want to." More silence. Then, in a softer voice, "I heard about your accident. I thought about calling, but I wouldn't have answered," Robert completed with brutal honesty. "But I'll answer now. Now I want to talk." They arranged to meet the following week. When he hung up, Robert realized he was shaking, not from fear, but from something akin to hope. A small, fragile thing, but it was there. Meanwhile, he decided what to do about Edward. It wouldn't be a public confrontation. It wouldn't be a flashy revenge. It would be something more strategic, more definitive. He consulted lawyers discreetly, prepared documentation, organized evidence, and he waited for the right moment. Edward came for his weekly visit, bringing more papers, more reports, more justifications, for decisions made without consultation. Robert received him with the same neutral expression as always, but this time, when Edward extended documents for his signature, Robert read them, really read them. Page by page, line by line. Edward became visibly uncomfortable. "Is there a problem?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Just being careful. I've realized I've been signing a lot of things without proper attention." "Well, you're recovering. It's natural that—" "I know what you did, Edward." The words came out calmly, almost softly, but they carried a weight that filled the room. Edward turned pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The handrail, the payments, the conversations about accelerating the power transition. I know everything." Edward opened and closed his mouth, searching for words. Finally, when he realized denial was futile, his face transformed. The mask of friendly concern fell away, revealing something colder underneath. "You would have done the same thing in my place," he said, his voice devoid of remorse. "An opportunity came up. I took it. It's exactly what you always taught." "I know. That's why I'm not going to the police." Edward blinked, surprised. "I'm not going to expose this publicly. I'm not going to sue. I'm not going to make a scene. But you're going to leave. You will resign from all positions in the group. You will sell your shares at fair market value. You will disappear." "And if I refuse?" Robert smiled. It was a humorless smile, but one with a clear understanding of power games. "Then I take everything public. The evidence I have isn't enough for a conviction. You were too careful. But it's enough to destroy your reputation. You'll never work in a position of trust again. You'll never have access to the circles that matter. Your choice." Edward looked at him for a long moment. There was anger there, but also the recognition of defeat. Finally, he nodded. "You've changed, Robert. The man I knew would have destroyed me completely." "The man you knew would have done exactly what you did," Robert replied. "That's why I'm changing." Edward left without looking back. Robert remained alone in the room, feeling something strange. It wasn't the satisfaction of victory. It wasn't relief. It was something closer to sadness. Sadness for having created a world where people like Edward and himself thrived. Sophia appeared at the doorway, minutes later, looking at him with that emotional reading ability that children have. "Is everything okay?" "It's going to be," Robert answered, and for the first time, he believed it. The weeks following Edward's departure were harder than Robert had anticipated. Not because of the loss of his partner, he processed that with relative ease, but because of what that loss revealed about everything he had built. He had spent his entire life erecting an empire based on principles he now recognized as fundamentally flawed, and that realization was too heavy to carry alone. The meeting with Beatrice took place on Saturday afternoon. She came to the mansion, hesitant, carrying more than a decade of grievances but also a cautious hope. When Robert saw her standing in the doorway, he realized how much time had passed. His sister was older, with grey strands in her hair that hadn't been there before, wrinkles around her eyes that told stories he didn't know. "Hey, Rob," she said, using the childhood nickname no one else used. "Hey, B." They stood in an awkward silence for a moment, until Beatrice took the first step, approaching and hugging her brother. Robert was stiff at first, but then he yielded. He let himself be hugged. He let himself feel the connection he had severed years ago out of pride and stubbornness. They talked for hours. Beatrice told him about her life, about the nephews Robert had never met, about the husband she loved and whom Robert had never approved of because he wasn't ambitious enough. She spoke of the struggles, the joys, the ordinary things that make up a normal life. Robert listened, really listened, and realized how much he had missed. When it was his turn to speak, Robert didn't know where to begin. He ended up telling her everything. The accident, the discovery about Edward, Sophia, the slow, painful transformation happening inside him. Beatrice listened without interrupting, and when he finished, her eyes were moist. "You know what hurts the most?" she asked. "It's not that you pushed me away. It's that I always knew you had this better person inside you, but you chose not to let him out." "I didn't know how," Robert admitted. "I didn't know there were other ways to be strong that weren't through control and power. Are you learning now?" "I'm trying." Beatrice took his hand, and there was forgiveness in that gesture. Not complete forgiveness, not an erasure of the past, but the beginning of something that could, with time, become true reconciliation. After Beatrice left, with a promise to return the following week, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Gratitude. Gratitude for having a second chance, even if he didn't deserve it. But the universe seemed determined to test his transformation. 3 days later, Robert received a legal notice, a class-action lawsuit filed by 27 former employees fired during his recovery at the hands of Edward. The accusations were serious: a hostile work environment, degrading working conditions, arbitrary dismissals without just cause, psychological damages. Robert read the depositions with trembling hands. They were stories of people who had worked under his command, suffering unbearable pressure, impossible targets, public humiliation when they failed to meet expectations. Some had developed mental health problems. Others saw their marriages fall apart under the weight of work schedules that left no time for family. There were stories of people crying in the bathroom before meetings because they knew they would be humiliated. And the worst part, Robert recognized many of the patterns described. Not because Edward had invented them, but because they were methods that Robert himself had validated, encouraged, and sometimes personally implemented. Edward had only continued what Robert had started. His lawyer recommended a settlement. It was the most practical solution, the least damaging to the company's image, the quickest way to close the matter. But Robert remembered Sophia's words about forgiveness, about doing what was right, even when it was hard. He made a decision that horrified his lawyer. He instructed them to publicly acknowledge responsibility, not just to pay settlements, but to admit that yes, the work environment was toxic, that yes, people were harmed, that yes, profit was prioritized over human well-being systematically and intentionally. But that's an admission of guilt, the lawyer argued. It will set a precedent. It will encourage more lawsuits. "I know," Robert replied, "and it's the right thing to do, because we are guilty." He went further. He created a compensation fund that went far beyond what any court settlement would require. Amounts that would acknowledge not just what was legally due, but the emotional damage, the lost time, the harmed lives. He established a free psychological support program, not just for those who sued, but for any former employee who needed it. When the news was released, it had an immediate impact. Some newspapers celebrated it as an unprecedented example of corporate responsibility. Others criticized it as an unnecessary admission of guilt, an overly expensive public relations stunt. Investors grew nervous. The group's stock fell temporarily. Robert didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't doing something for the sake of image or financial results. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do, and there was a strange freedom in that choice. But the pressure took its toll. The sleepless nights, the stress of confronting decades of accumulated mistakes, the profound and rapid emotional transformation, all of it began to affect his health. Robert developed hypertension. He had episodes of tachycardia that frightened his doctors. His physical recovery, which had been progressing slowly, stalled. Dr. Evans, the neurologist, was blunt in a consultation. "Your body is responding to the emotional stress. The progress we were seeing has completely stopped. If you continue like this, there could be setbacks." "What do you want me to do?" Robert asked bitterly. "Go back to not caring about anything?" "I want you to find balance. Change is necessary, but it can't come at the cost of your health. You need to learn to forgive not only others, but yourself." Forgive himself. Robert didn't even know where to begin with that. How could he forgive decades of choices that had harmed so many people? How could he accept that he was exactly the type of person he had always theoretically despised? It was Sophia who noticed something was wrong. She had developed a special sensitivity to his moods, could read the small changes in his expression, the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided looking her in the eye. "You're getting sick again," she stated, not asked. "I'm fine." "No, you're not. You're sad on the inside. And when we get sad on the inside, our bodies get sick on the outside." Robert tried to smile, but the effort failed. "It's more complicated than that." "No, it's not. You're blaming yourself. My mom does that sometimes. She keeps thinking about all the things she did wrong and forgets to think about the things she's doing right now." "But the things I did wrong are so many, Sophia. I know, my mom told me some of them. About when she asked for help and you didn't help." Robert felt shame burn in his chest. "But you know what my mom said?" Sophia continued. "She said that people can change, that you're trying to change, and that trying is already very important." The girl came closer and climbed onto his lap, a gesture that had become routine. "You know what I think," she whispered, as if sharing an important secret. "I think God loves you, even when you do bad things. And if God loves you, you can love yourself a little bit too." Robert felt tears well up, and this time he didn't hold them back. He let them run freely as he hugged this child who had enough faith for both of them. That night, Robert made a conscious decision. He would start to make peace with himself, not by erasing the past, but by accepting it as part of who he was, while actively choosing to be different from now on. He resumed physical therapy, this time with genuine commitment. The sessions were brutally difficult. His body resisted every movement. Every effort was a battle against muscles that had forgotten how to respond. But there was a difference now. There was a purpose beyond wounded pride. Sophia began to accompany him to the sessions whenever she could. She would sit in a corner, drawing or doing homework, but her presence made a difference. When Robert wanted to give up, when the pain seemed too unbearable, he would look at her and find a strength he didn't know he had. The progress returned, slow, microscopic, but consistent. A finger that moved a few millimeters more. A tingling sensation where before there had been only total absence. The doctors remained cautious, refusing to promise anything beyond what science could guarantee. But Robert didn't need promises. He just needed possibilities. Dr. Evans confessed in a consultation that the case was becoming a subject of interest in specialized medical circles. The recovery was defying initial expectations in ways they couldn't fully explain. "It's as if your body is responding to something beyond the rehabilitation protocol," the doctor said, studying scans with a puzzled expression. "There's neural activity in areas that should be permanently silent." Robert didn't mention Sophia. He didn't mention the prayers, the small hand holding his, the borrowed faith of a child. Not because he was ashamed, but because some things lived in a territory that scans couldn't map. The reorganization of the corporate group began. Robert brought in new board members, people with a history of ethical management and social responsibility. People the old Robert would have dismissed as naive idealists. But the new Robert recognized that perhaps naivety was just another name for hope. He transferred significant shares to a fund managed with a focus on sustainability and social impact. He created protection mechanisms for employees, including mandatory representation in strategic decisions. He limited his own power, even though he knew he could retake control if he wanted to, but he didn't want to, not anymore. Helen watched all these changes with eyes that showed growing surprise. One day, while tidying the living room, she commented, "I never thought I'd see this." "What?" "You becoming the person you always could have been." Robert smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Me neither." "And do you regret it?" The time you lost being different? Every day. But regret without action is just self-pity. I prefer to focus on what I can do now. Helen nodded, and there was respect in that gesture. Respect she had never felt for the powerful boss, but which she felt now for the humble man who was learning to rebuild not an empire, but a life. At night, alone in his room, Robert reflected on the journey. 6 months ago, he was confined by anger and pride, refusing rehabilitation, pushing everyone away. Now he was doing physical therapy with real commitment, reconciling with his sister, taking responsibility for past mistakes, trying to build something better. It wasn't complete redemption. Maybe it never would be, but it was an honest beginning. And honest beginnings, he discovered, were more valuable than perfect endings. Sophia was right. People could change, and he was living proof. Life had found a rhythm Robert had never imagined possible. December arrived, bringing the typical heat of a New York summer, and with it, a sense of peace he hadn't known since childhood. The mornings began with physical therapy. The afternoons often included Sophia. The evenings were dedicated to reflection and, increasingly, to phone calls with Beatrice. His physical recovery continued to surprise the doctors. Robert could now stand for longer periods, walk short distances with minimal support. It wasn't the mobility he had before, and it probably never would be, but it was infinitely more than any specialist had predicted. Dr. Evans remained fascinated by the case, documenting every bit of progress, every advance that defied clinical expectations. In a recent consultation, he had mentioned the possibility of presenting the case at an international medical conference. Robert agreed, as long as Sophia's identity was protected. Some things were too sacred for public exposure. It was on a Monday morning, Christmas Eve, that everything changed. Robert was in the living room, reviewing some final documents for the corporate reorganization, when he heard a sound that froze his blood. A scream, Helen shouting his name with an urgency he had never heard before. "Mr. Thompson, quick!" He maneuvered his wheelchair toward the kitchen, where the voice was coming from. What he saw when he reached the doorway took his breath away. Sophia was unconscious on the floor, pale as a sheet, her lips tinged with blue. Helen was kneeling beside her, trembling violently, phone in hand, dialing 911. She was playing and suddenly said she felt dizzy, Helen explained, her voice breaking. Then she just collapsed. She's not responding. Robert felt absolute panic, an emotion he hadn't experienced in decades, but he forced himself to maintain control. He yelled for the driver, who was in the back of the house, to bring the car around immediately. He instructed Helen to grab Sophia's medical documents, which he knew she kept. He took his own cell phone and called the director of Mount Sinai directly, using connections he had sworn never to use for personal gain again. "This is Robert Thompson. I need the best pediatric cardiology team ready in 10 minutes. It's an emergency. I won't take no for an answer." The drive to the hospital was the longest of Robert's life. He was in the back seat, Sophia unconscious in Helen's lap, holding the girl's cold little hand, whispering words he didn't even know he knew. "Hang on, little one. Please hang on. You can't leave me now, not after everything." Helen was crying silently, praying in a low voice, words jumbled between sobs. Robert, who had spent his entire life despising faith, found himself doing something he had never done. He prayed. He didn't know if he was doing it right, didn't know if anyone was listening, but the words came out anyway. "If there's anyone up there, please, not her. Take anything from me, but not her." They arrived at the hospital in record time. The medical team was waiting, just as Robert had demanded. Sophia was rushed away immediately, doctors moving with a controlled urgency that Robert recognized as a sign of extreme gravity. Hours passed, endless hours in the waiting room, with Robert unable to sit still, even with his physical limitations. He tried to pace back and forth, leaning on a walker just to have something to do. Helen was paralyzed, staring into space, her lips moving in constant prayer. Beatrice arrived as soon as Robert called. She didn't ask for details, she just came. She sat beside her brother, holding his hand, offering a silent presence that was all she could give. Finally, after what felt like days but was 4 hours, a doctor appeared. He was young, but he had that serious expression doctors develop when dealing with difficult cases. Family of Sophia Helen Carvalho. Helen jumped from her chair, Robert following as quickly as he could. She's stable for the moment, the doctor began, and Robert felt his knees want to buckle with relief. But there was something in his tone that indicated the news wasn't all good. What happened? Helen asked, her voice trembling. The doctor consulted his clipboard, choosing his words carefully. Sophia has a history of a congenital heart defect, correct? Treated when she was a baby. Helen nodded, unable to speak. What seems to have happened is a late complication. The defect, which we thought had been completely corrected, has deteriorated. The heart valve is failing. She will need surgery. Urgently. When? Robert asked, his voice firmer than he expected. Ideally within the next 48 hours. The longer we wait, the greater the risk of permanent damage to the heart muscle. Do it, Robert said immediately. Do whatever is necessary. The doctor hesitated, looking uncomfortable. I understand the desire to act quickly, but there are practical issues. The surgery is complex, expensive. We need to verify insurance coverage, authorization. How much does it cost? Robert cut in. The doctor blinked, surprised by the direct question. The complete surgery, with post-operative care and medication, somewhere around $500,000. I'll pay for it, all of it now. Bring in the best surgeons available. I don't want the on-call team. I want the best in the country. The world, if necessary. Money is no object. Mr. Thompson, Helen intervened, her voice weak. I can't accept this. It's too much money. Robert turned to her, and Helen saw something in his eyes that silenced her. It wasn't the coldness of before. It was a determination born of love. Helen, this girl saved my life in ways you can't even imagine. When you asked me for help years ago, I said no because I was a coward and selfish. I will not make the same mistake twice. Let me do this, not as charity, as not a debt I can never fully repay. Tears were streaming down Helen's face. Please, Robert continued, his voice breaking, let me save her, like she saved me. Helen covered her face with her hands, sobbing. When she finally managed to speak, she just whispered, Thank you. Robert turned back to the doctor. Arrange everything. I want a consultation with the specialists in an hour. I want a complete surgical plan. I want you to treat my daughter. He paused, corrected himself, his voice soft. I want you to treat Sophia as if she were the most important person in the world, because to me she is. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of consultations, tests, and preparations. Robert mobilized every resource he had. He brought in a specialist from New York who was a leader in pediatric cardiac surgery. He consulted with international doctors via teleconference. He ensured every detail was perfect. Sophia woke up a few hours later, still weak but conscious. When she saw Robert beside her bed, she smiled faintly. Hi, Mr. Robert. Hi, little one. You're crying. Robert touched his own face, surprised to find tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. I am. Because you scared me so much. Sorry. Sophia tried to sit up but didn't have the strength. I'm scared. I know. I'm scared too. The honesty seemed to comfort her more than any reassuring lie would have. But you know what I learned from you? Robert continued, taking her hand. I learned that when we're scared, we don't have to face it alone. And you're not alone. Your mom is here. I'm here. And we're going to get through this together. Will you stay? I'm not leaving your side. I promise. And Robert Thompson, the man who had spent his entire life avoiding promises because commitments were traps, made that promise with every fiber of his being. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning. The night before was one of the longest Robert had ever lived. He stayed by Sophia's side as she slept, watching every breath, every movement. Helen dozed in an uncomfortable chair on the other side of the bed. Beatrice had gone to get clothes and necessary items, but promised to be back before the surgery. In the silence of that hospital night, Robert reflected on the absurd journey that had brought him here. A year ago, he was at the pinnacle of power, controlling a corporate empire, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he was above basic human concerns like compassion and connection. Now he was sitting in a wheelchair next to a hospital bed, watching a 7-year-old child who had become more important to him than any business ever was, and he realized that this moment, this visceral fear of losing someone he loved, was the most human thing he had ever experienced. Sophia stirred, opening her eyes. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice sleepy. "I don't want to miss a single minute with you," Robert answered honestly. She smiled, then grew serious. "Mr. Robert, if I don't say that. But if something happens, I want you to know that you're one of the best things that ever happened to me. You were sad, and now you're less sad. That's important." Robert felt his throat tighten. "Sophia, you completely transformed my life. Before you, I was alive, but not living. You taught me that being strong isn't about never needing anyone. It's about having the courage to let people in. I knew you'd learn," she said, with that childlike wisdom that always disarmed him. "That's why I prayed so much." "Will you keep praying?" "Always, but now you can pray too. It helps." And there, in that hospital room, Robert Thompson prayed. For real, this time. Not just desperate words, but something deeper. An honest conversation with something bigger than himself, acknowledging that not everything was under his control and that it was okay not to have control. That there were things more important than power. That there was love and faith and hope. The morning came too soon. The medical team came to get Sophia. She was scared, Robert could see, but she was trying to be brave. "You're going to be okay," he said, holding her hand as they prepped her. "You have the best doctors taking care of you, and when you wake up, I'll be here." "Promise?" "I promise." They took her away, and Robert felt as if a piece of his own heart had been torn out. Helen collapsed into his arms, and for the first time, it was Robert who offered comfort, who held someone while they cried, who said everything would be okay even without being sure himself. The hours of surgery were torture. Robert tried to read, tried to work, tried anything to distract his mind. Nothing worked. Beatrice arrived with coffee and food that no one could eat. Others began to show up, employees from the mansion, members of Helen's church, even some from the new corporate board. The waiting room filled with people who, in different ways, had been touched by Sophia, and Robert realized that this little girl had a much bigger impact than he had imagined, not just on him but on everyone around her. 6 hours later, the surgeon finally appeared. He was tired, but he was smiling, and that smile was the most beautiful sight Robert had ever seen. "The surgery was a success," he announced. "Sophia is stable, responding well. She'll need intensive care for a few days, but the prognosis is excellent." The room erupted in relieved sobs. Helen fell to her knees, thanking God out loud. Robert just closed his eyes, letting tears stream freely, whispering a thank you that came from a place so deep he didn't know it existed. When they were finally allowed to visit, Sophia was awake, pale and connected to tubes but alive. Her eyes lit up when she saw Robert. "You stayed," she whispered. "I said I would. You always keep your promises now." "I'll always keep the ones I make to you." Helen kissed her daughter's forehead repeatedly, unable to stop touching her, to verify that she was real, that she was there. In the following days, as Sophia recovered, Robert practically lived at the hospital. He brought work, held meetings via video conference, but never left for more than a few hours. He was there when Sophia woke up, there when she needed encouragement during painful procedures, there when she had nightmares at night. And one afternoon, a week after the surgery, when Sophia was already much better, she looked at him with that seriousness that sometimes made her seem much older. "Mr. Robert, you paid for my surgery, right?" "I did." "Why?" "My mum said it's a lot of money." Robert thought carefully about his answer. "Because a long time ago, your mother asked me for help for you, and I said no. It was one of the worst decisions I ever made. This time, I had a chance to do things differently, to be the person I should have, been from the beginning." "So you did it because you felt guilty?" "No, I did it because I love you. You've become family to me, Sophia, and we take care of the people we love." The girl smiled, and it was the purest smile Robert had ever seen. "You're my family too," she said, "my uncle of the heart." Robert didn't trust his own voice to reply. He just nodded, smiling through his tears. When Sophia was finally discharged, 2 weeks before Christmas, it was as if the world had regained its color. Robert arranged for everything so she could recover comfortably at the mansion, in the room he had had specially prepared. Helen initially protested, but Robert was adamant. "You will stay here until Sophia is fully recovered. No discussion." And so, for the first time in decades, Robert Thompson's mansion was filled with life, with a child's laughter, with women's conversations, with a human warmth he had always kept outside. It was noisy. It was chaotic. It was everything Robert had always avoided. It was perfect. January brought heavy rains that washed over New York City and symbolically seemed to wash away the last layers of resistance Robert still held. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with Edward, and the transformation that had begun as a tiny crack in his armor was now a complete structural change. The physical therapy continued, now 5 times a week, with Robert showing a determination that impressed even the most experienced therapists. But it wasn't the cold, calculated determination of before. It was something warmer, more human. It was the urgency of someone who had wasted decades and now wanted to savor every second that remained. On one particularly intense morning, after an exhausting series of exercises, Robert achieved something the doctors had said was unlikely. He stood up, without support from the parallel bars. Just him, his trembling legs, and a willpower that came from a place deeper than muscles. It was only for 5 seconds, but it was 5 seconds on his feet, supporting his own weight, defying diagnoses and probabilities. Sophia, who was there as always, let out a shriek of joy so loud that nurses came running to see what had happened. "I knew it!" she yelled, jumping up and down. "I knew you could do it! I asked every day and it happened!" The doctors were more cautious. Dr. Evans examined him exhaustively, repeated tests, consulted specialists. The consensus was that there was significant neurological recovery beyond what they had expected. It wasn't a complete cure, and it probably never would be. But it was real, measurable, scientifically documented progress. "How do you explain this?" Robert asked the neurologist. Dr. Evans hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Honestly, I can't fully explain it. Neuroplasticity has its limits, and you're pushing those limits in ways that medical literature suggests are improbable. There are factors at play here beyond the rehabilitation protocol." "Like what?" The doctor smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Like extraordinary determination, like the emotional support you clearly have, like possibly things that my scientific training doesn't equip me to measure or understand." Robert looked at Sophia, who was drawing peacefully while they waited. The girl looked up, felt his eyes on her and smiled. A simple, pure smile, full of the absolute certainty that everything would be okay. And Robert, who had spent 53 years rejecting anything that couldn't be logically explained, accepted that perhaps there were mysteries worth not unraveling. Perhaps there were things that worked better when simply accepted. In the following days, Robert began to practice walking. They were tiny steps supported by bars, by walkers, by anything that could provide stability. Each step was a celebrated achievement. Every yard covered was a monumental victory. Helen watched it all with eyes that showed genuine pride. The relationship between them had completely transformed. They were no longer boss and employee. They were something closer to friends. Friends with a complicated history, but friends nonetheless. One day, as Robert rested after a particularly difficult session, Helen sat down beside him. "You know Sophia talks about you at school?" Robert raised his eyebrows, surprised. "What does she say?" "That she has a friend who's learning to walk again. That he used to be very sad, but now he's less sad. That she prays for him every day." Robert felt something tighten in his chest. "She's special." "I know, and so are you. Different from how you were, but special in your own way." Helen hesitated, then continued. "I want you to know that I've forgiven you for what happened years ago. Not because I forgot, but because I saw you change. I saw you become someone who would do things differently if you could go back in time." "I would," Robert confirmed, his voice hoarse. "I would do everything differently. But you can't. So what matters is what you do now. And what you're doing now is right." It was an absolution Robert didn't know he needed so badly. Tears streamed down his face, and he didn't hide them. He let Helen see them. He let himself be vulnerable. The invitation arrived on a rainy afternoon. The new board of directors of the corporate group was organizing an event to reintroduce the management. It would be a formal ceremony with investors, partners, and the press. Robert was invited, but with no obligation to attend. He didn't have to go, he wasn't expected to, but Robert decided to go, not out of obligation, by choice, because there were things he needed to say, a testimony he needed to give. Sophia insisted on helping him choose his outfit. It was a surreal moment, a 53-year-old man being advised by a 7-year-old child on which tie to wear. But Robert accepted it with a humor he wouldn't have had before. When she chose a light blue tie, saying that color reminded her of a clear sky and hope, he wore it without question. The event took place at a hotel in the financial district, a huge ballroom decorated with the corporate elegance Robert recognized from hundreds of similar events throughout his life. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't the protagonist, he was a spectator. And he was okay with that. He arrived in a wheelchair, accompanied by Helen and Sophia. The girl wore a party dress that Helen had bought especially for the occasion, her hair tied back with a ribbon that Sophia chose because it matched Robert's tie. Curious glances followed his entrance. Some people approached to greet him, others kept a respectful distance. The ceremony began. Speeches were made about the group's new direction, about a commitment to ethical practices, about social responsibility. Numbers were presented showing that it was possible to be profitable without destroying lives in the process. Polite applause punctuated the speeches. Robert listened to it all with a different kind of attention than he would have before. He saw through the pretty words, recognized when they were genuine and when they were just rhetoric. But he also saw hope there. Hope that maybe it was possible to build something better. When the official speeches ended and the networking portion began, Robert signaled to the master of ceremonies that he would like to say a few words. There was hesitation, quick consultations, but they finally agreed. After all, he was Robert Thompson. He still carried enough weight for his request to be granted. The ballroom fell silent as Robert approached the stage. A few people helped position his wheelchair near the microphone. Sophia stood in the front row, her hands clasped as if she were praying. Beatrice, whom Robert had invited, was beside her. Helen remained in the back, but her eyes were fixed on him. Robert looked out at the audience. Executives, investors, journalists, employees, people who had known him when he was powerful and who now saw him physically diminished but, he hoped, grown in other ways. He took a deep breath and began, without notes, without preparation, just raw truth. "Many of you have known me for years. You know that I built this corporate group from almost nothing, turning it into one of the largest conglomerates in the country. And for a long time I thought that defined my success. I thought power and profit were the only metrics that mattered." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I was wrong, deeply, completely wrong. I built an empire on the suffering of the people who worked for me, on families destroyed by impossible demands, on lives harmed because I believed that results justified any method." The audience was absolutely silent. Some faces showed shock, others intense curiosity. "When I had my accident, I thought I had lost everything. My mobility, my control, my power. And I did lose those things. But I gained something infinitely more valuable. I gained the chance to see who I really was when you stripped away everything I had built to protect myself." He looked at Sophia, who was smiling encouragingly. "And what I saw wasn't pretty. I saw a man who caused pain and called it leadership, who destroyed people and called it efficiency, who confused power with human worth." Beatrice had tears in her eyes, so did Helen. "I'm not here to ask for public forgiveness. That would be too easy, and the people I hurt deserve more than easy words. I'm here to say that I understand now. I understand that success without humanity is not success, it's just empty accumulation. He took a longer pause, preparing for what was to come. I spent months in a wheelchair, thinking my greatest loss was not being able to walk. But it wasn't. The greatest loss would have been to continue being the man I was before. And the greatest blessing was finding people who taught me that real strength isn't about never falling. It's about having the courage to get up different. Then, slowly, pushing up on the arms of his chair, Robert began to rise. A collective gasp went through the audience. Some stood up instinctively, ready to help. But Robert raised a hand, asking them to wait. The seconds felt like an eternity. His legs trembled violently with the effort, muscles that had been dormant for almost a year protesting against the weight. But he did it. He stood, unsteadily, holding onto the bars that had been discreetly placed there for this moment. Sophia let out a cry of joy, and some in the audience began to applaud. But Robert wasn't finished. There was one last thing he needed to do. With microscopic, painfully slow steps, he began to walk. They weren't firm steps, they were shaky, uncertain, dependent on the support of the bars. But they were steps, one after another, crossing the few feet that separated him from the edge of the stage. The ballroom was in total silence now. Everyone understood they were witnessing something important. Not just a physical recovery, but a transformation of another order. Reaching the point he had planned, Robert let go of the bars. For a perilous moment he stood unsupported, swaying. The audience held its breath collectively. And then, slowly, with visible effort and profound dignity, Robert Thompson knelt. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The man who had spent his entire life refusing to bow to anything or anyone, who saw humility as weakness, was kneeling. Not forced by physical limitation, but by a conscious emotional choice. Kneeling there, on the stage before hundreds of people, Robert let the tears run freely. They were not tears of weakness, they were tears of liberation. They were the tears of someone who had finally allowed himself to be vulnerable, to be human, to be imperfect. When he finally rose, with the help of security guards who quickly came on stage, he returned to the microphone. His voice was hoarse, thick with emotion, but firm. They say it takes courage to lead, but I've discovered it takes far greater courage to recognize when you were wrong, to admit that being strong sometimes means being vulnerable, to understand that true victory isn't never falling, but having the humility to get up changed. He took a final pause, looking at everyone he loved, Sophia beaming with pride, Helen crying openly, Beatrice smiling through her tears. I built an empire, but I almost destroyed my soul in the process. It took losing everything to discover what truly matters. And what matters isn't glass towers or bank accounts. It's human connection, it's kindness. It's the ability to change when you recognize you're wrong. It's the courage to be vulnerable. He returned to his wheelchair, exhausted, but at peace. The audience didn't know how to react at first. Some applauded, others remained in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. But Robert didn't need their approval. He didn't need external validation. He just needed inner peace. And for the first time in 53 years, he had it. Sophia ran to him as soon as he left the stage, throwing herself into his arms with a force disproportionate to her size. Robert hugged her tightly, whispering, "Thank you for everything, for not giving up on me when I had given up on myself." "I would never give up," she replied, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "You're my friend." Helen approached too, and for the first time since she had worked for him, she touched his face. Not with the reverence of an employee, but with the genuine affection of someone who had seen an impossible transformation happen. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. Beatrice came last, hugging the brother she had gotten back after so long. "Welcome back, Rob." The following months brought changes no one could have predicted. The corporate group flourished under new management, not with explosive growth, but with sustainable and ethical growth. Employees began to talk about going to work without fear, about an environment that respected human limits. Robert continued his recovery. He never returned to his previous level of mobility, but he was eventually able to walk short distances without support. Doctors catalogued his case in specialized journals, citing it as an example of recovery that defied conventional explanations. But Robert knew there was Nothing conventional about the explanation. It was faith borrowed from a child. It was the unconditional love of an employee who had every reason to hate him but chose to forgive. It was the reconnection with a sister who never completely gave up on him. It was the courage to look at his own reflection and not like what he saw but have the willingness to change. Sophia remained a constant presence in his life. She grew, went to 3rd grade, developed a new passion for science, and continued to pray for him every day. Robert helped her with her homework, discovering that teaching simple concepts to a child was infinitely more gratifying than closing multi-million-dollar deals. Beatrice became a regular part of his life. Weekly dinners became a tradition. Robert met his nephews, learned to like the brother-in-law he once despised, and participated in family conversations that had nothing to do with business. Helen remained, but their relationship changed completely. They were friends now, genuinely. Robert significantly increased her salary, not as a gesture of guilt but in recognition of what she had always deserved. More importantly, he offered her the respect he should have offered from the beginning. And Robert, the man who had spent 53 years believing that strength was synonymous with control, finally learned the meaning of true courage. It was the courage to admit a mistake, to apologize without justifications, to accept that not everything can be solved with cold logic, to recognize that vulnerability is not weakness, but the most honest form of strength. It was the courage to let go of pride and let something bigger, something he still didn't fully understand but had learned to respect, guide his steps. It was the courage to kneel when the world expected him to stand tall. On a March afternoon, exactly 1 year after the accident, Robert was sitting on the terrace of his mansion, no longer alone. Sophia was drawing on the floor. Helen was preparing tea in the kitchen. Beatrice was on her way for a family dinner. The sun was setting over New York, painting the sky orange and pink, and Robert Thompson, looking at the city he had always tried to conquer, finally understood that true victory was never about conquest. It was about connection. It was about being part of something bigger than himself. The real healing was never in his legs. It was always in his perspective, in the way he saw the world, saw people, saw himself. And for the first time in his life, Robert liked what he saw when he looked in the mirror, not because he was perfect, but because he was honest, because he was human, because he was finally learning to live. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Robert and Sophia has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of transformation, of falling and being reborn, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it when Robert discovered Edward's betrayal, when he reconciled with his sister, when Sophia held his hand for the first time, or when he finally knelt before everyone? Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest and truest side of the human soul. Stories about imperfect people learning to be better, about falls that teach more than victories, about a love that heals what seemed incurable. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with a new story that will touch your soul.